Welcome, I'm Jade Van Treese, the Communications Manager with the Non-GMO Project, and a very warm welcome to our guest today, Liz Carlisle, author of the new book, Healing Grounds, Climate Justice and Deep Roots of Regenerative Agriculture. I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement that I am currently on unceded ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, who have lived here in Bellingham and Whatcom County from time immemorial, and specifically the Nooksack Indian tribe and the Lummi Nation. Pertaining to this conversation as well, I also want to acknowledge that our country and our agricultural system was built on the backs of Black, Latinx, Asian American labor, some against their will, to work the land that has fed us in the past and continues to feed us today. Our guest today, Liz Carlisle, is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. She's written 3 books about regenerative farming and agroecology: Lentil Underground, Grain by Grain, and most recently, Healing Grounds. Welcome, Liz.
Great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. To all of our viewers joining us live, we're giving away 5 free copies of Liz's book today. You can enter in the chat and find information on how, where to sign up, and we'll also be doing a live Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions for Liz, please add them there too. Oh, okay. Just one moment. All right, thanks. So Liz, in your book, you ask the question if soil can really save us. With our expanded understanding of soil science, could you give our viewers a brief understanding of how returning carbon to the soil works as a solution to climate change?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jade. And it is really incredible and also kind of simple and elegant at the same time. And might recall for some folks, biology lessons from maybe pretty early on in your life about just the miracle of what plants do. They are this incredible conduit of what is in the atmosphere back down into the soil, and specifically carbon. And so when we, for example, revegetate areas that have been degraded, or when we farm in a way that really works with plants and works with plant roots, there's this potential to actually draw down some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere back down into the soil. And what we know is that over hundreds of years of an extractive industrial agriculture, a lot of that carbon that used to be in the soil has been lost to the atmosphere. When you think about, prairies being plowed up and then farmed in a way where there's not vegetation on that land all year round. And so there is this incredible promise of healing through a regenerative agriculture that restores those roots in the ground. But as I know we're going to go into today, that concept of being rooted rather than uprooted, it actually goes a lot deeper than just the soil science.
Excellent. Thanks for that. As it relates to agriculture in the US, you write, the seeds of climate catastrophe were planted in this broken ground. What do you mean by broken ground, and how does the book Healing Grounds come to this realization?
Yeah, well, so I've been studying agriculture and climate change for about 12 years now. What I love doing more than anything is talking to farmers who are working on shifting agriculture from being part of the climate problem to being part of the climate solution. And when I first started looking at the connections between agriculture and climate, I was really drawn to the World War II period and the moment at which agriculture industrialized really significantly, because there were a lot more chemicals being used in agriculture. In the wake of World War II and all of these munitions factories, those were transitioned to the peacetime use of agricultural chemicals. And so I was really focused on that period as the starting point of an agriculture that became a big part of the climate problem. And there's a lot of good reason to look at that historical period. If we think about, the degree to which synthetic nitrogen fertilizer contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, if we think about the degree to which our industrial feedlot systems and family factory farms of animal, our sort of animal meat protein system, a lot of that comes from that period. But in researching this book, what I realized was that extractive agriculture actually is much deeper. I actually had to go back, 400, 500 years in history to realize that the agricultural system we have now, the industrial extractive agricultural system we have now, it's really built on the model and the logic of colonialism. And so the extraction, the origin point of thinking about our food system as being rooted in extraction, that's colonialism. That's the genocide of indigenous peoples on this continent. That's bringing African people against their will to be enslaved in an agriculture on this continent. And if you don't take it back all the way to those roots of setting up an agricultural system that is so deeply extractive by its very nature, I think it's hard to get to the root cause of the problem of why we have an agricultural system that would do something as silly as extracting carbon out of the soil and volatilizing it into the atmosphere. It only makes sense that our agriculture would be set up that way once you realize, oh, this was part of a colonial project. And that's my interest in this book, in Healing Grounds, is to take the colonial project out of agriculture so that we as the folks living in the United States now can redesign our agriculture around the healing of people, communities, and land.
Beautiful. Thank you. You cover many topics of wounding for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American farmers throughout your book. And what can you tell us about how this shaped the naming of your book, Healing Grounds?
Yeah, well, I guess one of my hopes for this book is to infuse the conversation about regenerative agriculture with the imperative of healing and repair. And I think the word regeneration invites that level of depth. To me, it sort of asks the question, what has been damaged and what do we need to do to fix it or to restore health? But sometimes, we can talk about regeneration at just this very technical level or an ecological level that doesn't quite get to the way in which social relationships are part of this too. And so by using the title Healing Grounds and then, regenerative farming in the subtitle, my hope is to indicate that regenerative farming practices need to be part of this larger process of healing, and that we can't really address just the technical aspects of agriculture without getting to this larger arc of colonial extraction and oppression towards, healing, repair, all the things that need to happen both socially and ecologically for people and land to be whole. And maybe for some folks that sounds a little overwhelming. For me, there's actually, I find that very hopeful because I see a lot of synergy in the work of addressing climate change and pursuing racial justice. I realize that pursuing those things synergistically and understanding the links between them, I think in some ways, actually, to me, I see that way forward a lot more clearly than when I think about them as being, totally separate.
Excellent. And talking about technology and some of the farming practices in general, how does your work explore technology's role in farming in the US, and like the use of GMOs, for example? And how does it explore traditional technology on the other hand, such as Indigenous people of this land and regenerative agriculture as a way of life? Can we have both the traditional technology as a part of the solution and in the climate crisis, as well as solving problems in our food system?
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that question, Jade, because I love particularly the way you're talking about technology in such an inclusive way, because you're absolutely right. Technology and innovation has been part of how Indigenous Americans, Indigenous Asians, Indigenous Africans have been approaching food and farming for thousands and thousands of years. All these really brilliant approaches that you can absolutely understand as science and as technology. And yet oftentimes when vested interests really want to impose a particular kind of agricultural system, usually to benefit their own power or their own profit, they raise the specter of technology as a way of creating a division between something like a GMO seed and a variety that's been saved for generations and generations, basically drawing on these unfortunately very deep wells of racism and colonial thinking within our society to try to convince people that only for example, the GMO seed or even the hybrid seed, if we take it back several decades to kind of the OG form of improved seeds, is the way forward for modernity, which would have been maybe the word in the 50s, or sustainability, which might have been the word in the 90s, or regeneration, which is a word that sometimes you hear some of these kinds of high-tech outfits using today. So I do think it's really important to acknowledge that for example, the system that Indigenous prairie peoples used of fire in combination with grazing is an incredibly genius technology it's challenging to replicate that genius technology of good fire with any of these, quote unquote, high tech approaches. So I think it is really the question to ask is who gets to make the decisions about what technologies are governing our food and farm system, are being used to shape our food and farming system, and what are the goals that ultimately underlie the development of technologies. And so technologies that are developed towards the goal of profit for the few, obviously, no matter how quote unquote sophisticated they are, the problem with them is the aims that they were designed to achieve.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of conversations about farming, the people doing the work are frequently left out. About farmers you interview, you write, what's being regenerated is not just the soil, but a complex web of relationships. Can you talk about people and social justice as this in a component of agriculture?
Yeah, I think this is really important in the regenerative agriculture conversation, because one question that I find comes up a lot with folks who are skeptical of the idea that we can sequester a lot of carbon through regenerative agriculture, or just trying to ask the right questions. Oftentimes I hear people say, well, okay, if we have farmers planting soil building cover crops or reducing tillage or introducing regenerative grazing, all these kinds of techniques that you hear about in the regenerative agriculture conversation, if they do it, how do we know that carbon's going to stay there? Because, if we're going to build up a whole new, say, carbon credits program, or this is going to be part of say the United States meeting its commitment to the international community, if we're going to take this to one of the COP meetings, we have to have some kind of verification step. And the time period of interest is very long. We need to be able to guarantee that that carbon's going to stay in the ground and not get revolatilized into the atmosphere. How do we guarantee it? And a soil scientist can't give you the answer to that question. I collaborate with some incredible soil scientists who can tell you just fascinating things about microbial activity underground and the mechanisms that help soils sequester more carbon and the importance of roots and all those things. But the question they can't answer is that farmer going to sell the land and the next farmer is going to plow that field up, and all of that work that got done over the past 10, 20, 30 years is going to get volatilized in one season? That's not a question a soil scientist can answer. That's a social question. That's a question of, again, coming back to this kind of core theme of rootedness versus uprootedness. And so if we have a society that continually uproots the very people who work with land, and if we think about our labor system in agriculture in this country, dang, that's what it is now, and that is what it's been, since the origins of colonialism. You can't have that rootedness over generations and generations. You can't have that sense of belonging to land, that sense of 7 generations in the future belonging to land. That's what you really need in order to be able to go to COP and say, yeah, we know that if we restore this land in perennials or restore this prairie with buffalo, we know that's going to continue because we're also making sure that we're making whole the indigenous land stewards, the people who are always part of that buffalo prairie system. That's the guarantee.
Yeah, the continuation too, right? The continuing stewardship of land. Yeah. Before colonization, people lived and thrived on this land for several thousands of years. Can you tell us how the indigenous people of this land sustained food systems from time immemorial, and how indigenous practices can and are being brought back into our food system today?
Well, that's a huge question, and I definitely can't address all of it. And I'm not an expert in Indigenous food systems. I definitely recommend folks check out Elizabeth Hoover's work, especially if you're interested specifically in Indigenous food systems in the United States. She co-edited this beautiful volume that I use in my classes a lot. And I imagine a lot of folks on here may have read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which has been a huge inspiration to me and something I use in the classroom a lot as well. For this book, I'm originally from Montana, and so I spoke with Latrice Tatsey, who is a member of Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana. She's a soil ecologist who works on buffalo restoration, and she's interested in, as her people are bringing buffalo back to their homelands, what's the impact on soils and specifically soil carbon sequestration. And so, through Latrice, I've learned more about the history specifically in that region of Indigenous people and those relationships with buffalo, grazing, and fire, and the amazing productive prairie that resulted from all of those relationships. And specifically this idea of another Indigenous scholar I spoke with, Jill Falcon McKinn, the name of her dissertation is an Indigenous word that means, and I'll paraphrase here, but that which is given. And so understanding what's available at any given season and what's being offered and working with those rhythms of the seasons. And so that, in one sense, that's kind of the deeper teaching of the buffalo themselves and the whole buffalo food system and plains food system, is this idea of adjusting to the seasons and the rhythms of the land, which is what was disrupted so powerfully by fencing with the imposition of a cattle system and a property system and a reservation system. And so that's just one example of a whole Indigenous management philosophy that really comes from that deep relationship with land and that deep reciprocal relationship with land, of this commitment to giving back as part of a food system.
Beautiful. Thank you. And your book is full of sincere passages about the history of farming in the United States, and this imagery of enslaved Africans braiding seeds into their hair as they're forcibly removed from their homelands is a really powerful one. What does this tell us about people's connection to the land and to seeds and to their food?
Yeah, I'm going to offer a couple more book recommendations here because I drew really heavily on Leah Penniman's Farming While Black and Monica White's book Freedom Farmers, which both go much more deeply into that legacy of those who braided seeds into their hair before the brutal Middle Passage, and then sustained these practices for hundreds of years throughout the Black diaspora of regeneration and survival and resistance. And I think one of the biggest things that I draw from this story and how it contributes to my understanding of what regenerative agriculture is and what it needs to be to really meet the challenge of climate change at the scale that it is, and to really address it at its roots, is understanding that not only is regenerative agriculture rooted in the ancestral knowledge of Indigenous communities and communities of color that have these practices since way before colonization, and that those practices are embedded in these larger land management philosophies, but also that these regenerative agricultures have been tools of survival and resistance in the face of an extractive agriculture for those who've been on the front lines of it. And so it's not just that we're reaching back in history for some static record from 500 years ago of something that we're going to revive. That's not at all what I'm suggesting, or what I think a lot of these leaders that I've had the privilege of featuring are suggesting. In fact, those ancestral traditions have continued to be honed as these strategies of survival and resistance against the very thing that's causing, climate change in the agricultural sector, which is this extractive logic. And so that's what I hope folks take away from this book, maybe more than anything, is that we're not talking about some static past. We're actually talking about a really vibrant present within communities of color and Indigenous communities, where this struggle between the extractive mode and the healing mode is about agriculture, but it's also about so many other aspects of people's lives.
Thank you. Our guest today is Liz Carlisle, the author of Healing Grounds. And at the end of our conversation, we'll have a Q&A. If you have questions for Liz, please feel free to include them in our chat. All right. In Healing Grounds, Olivia Watkins talks about how trees living connected to one another in forest tend to live longer. How might this relate to the Southern Cooperative Movement, our Black farmers pooling their resources together to support each other in both farming and their livelihoods?
Yeah, so it was just such a privilege to speak with Olivia Watkins for this book. And she's the featured voice of the second chapter and kind of leads me and the reader through this history. And something that struck me from my first conversation with Olivia is the connections that she drew between cooperation in the natural world. And she's really excited about mycelium in particular, because she's raised mushrooms in a forested landscape. And so she's seen both within the forest itself and then within the mushrooms that she's raising, the importance of mycelium and this deep form of sharing resources, basically. But then she related that to this deep history of cooperation within the Black diaspora that she carries on. She's now leading the Black Farmer Fund and really putting her energy into raising capital so that other Black farmers can grow their businesses and succeed and, rekindle those historical relationships with land. But there's this long history in the civil rights movement, during Reconstruction, and even in the dooryard gardens of the enslaved, people continuing to raise these cultural foods and share them with one another. And so I think that connection that she drew of cooperation, it extends back really deeply in the Black diaspora, and I think also has this really exciting future forward, and is one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we take leadership from Black leaders in the regenerative agriculture movement, is this intellectual leadership on the principle of cooperation as having to be central to any kind of sustainable agricultural economy, as well as any kind of sustainable agricultural ecology.
Yeah, each of these women of color you interview has such a story tracing back generations to their ancestors. Without giving too much of your book away, because we would love for viewers to read this for themselves, can you tell us about why you chose these stories and how their history is relevant to us today? How do these stories reshape the common understanding of how many of us understand agriculture?
Yeah, well, it was really hard to choose sort of central voices and characters for this book, because I spoke with so many incredibly brilliant and wise and powerful leaders as I was doing interviews for this book, read about so many incredible, brilliant and wise and powerful leaders. So there's just an absolute wealth of leadership in Indigenous communities and communities of color in regenerative agriculture, agroecology, in this whole conversation. I was sort of working from my perspective, obviously, and for those who don't know already, I'm a white woman from a settler colonial background, and I thought about, in terms of people that I featured, I wanted to be in relationship in a way that I could be held accountable. And so it's really intentional that the folks who are featured come from either the place where I'm from, Montana, the place where I live and work, California. Olivia Watkins is stewarding this land in North Carolina, which is actually where my partner's family lives. And so these were places where I could maybe be in a little bit deeper relationship and be held accountable a little bit better. And also, I think there was that resonance and that connection from having that connection to a common place. And they're also just incredible people. Latrice Tatsey, who's the bison ecologist I spoke about earlier from Blackfeet Nation. Olivia Watkins, who stewards this forested plot of land where she's practicing agroforestry in North Carolina. Ida Guzman, who's a soil ecologist in California, who's done this incredible research showing the connections between diversity above ground, crop diversity, and diversity below ground in the microbial community that's so important to carbon sequestration. And then adding on the layer of cultural diversity, because the majority of the farmers she's working with are immigrant farmers, and that's why they have all these diverse cultural crops. And she herself comes from that background, as her parents immigrated from their small farm in Mexico, became farm workers in the United States. And so she's sort of seen these immigrant food systems that exist in the middle of California's Central Valley. And that's where she conducted her research. And then Nikiko Masamoto, who also lives in California's Central Valley, who's the third generation on her family's farm, growing peaches and nectarines and apricots and raisin grapes organically. And her family has this incredible story. Her grandparents, well, her great-grandparents immigrated to California from Japan and worked really, really hard, but faced incredible discrimination. And I think most importantly, in many ways, the alien land law, which prevented them from actually owning agricultural land as people of Japanese descent. And so they worked really hard. They tried to build up some kind of resources so that maybe their kids could have a farm if by chance this racist law was repealed someday. And then Nikiko's grandparents experienced incarceration during Japanese American internment during World War II. And so they lost everything. But they came out of incarceration and decided to literally plant roots in American soil and claim a place of belonging. And so, Nikiko's whole family story starts from that place of belonging and inclusion and rootedness, and really what it takes for immigrant families, for Indigenous families, for everybody who's now experienced colonization in some way, shape, or form, to come into this rootedness and this sense of, everybody having this place of belonging in agriculture in this country.
Yeah, as we mentioned, you're a professor at UC Santa Barbara. How are you sharing your learnings from Healing Grounds with your students, some of these topics that you're sharing with us today? And how might you imagine your students, when they're the ones teaching future generations, what do you hope that they'll be telling their children?
Yeah, well, my students are sharing these stories with me, which was a lot of the inspiration for working on this book, is that students, are continually bringing me these really inspiring stories from their own lives and from their own communities, and also their own visions of what they want agriculture to be in the future and what they demand that agriculture be in the future, which is something that I love about the generation of students that I work with at UC Santa Barbara, is they demand that agriculture serve the health of land and people. And what I hope going forward, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is that I want for students from diverse backgrounds to see that the future of regenerative agriculture builds on a legacy that their families and communities have actually built. And so sometimes, we have this kind of language of like first generation college students, as though people are the first in their family to like pursue higher education, advanced knowledge. I don't know what the term is. And there can be this disconnect when in fact people are coming in to a university, an educational institution, bringing so much of this knowledge, bringing so much of this wisdom. And the path forward, when students are thinking about their future as leaders in, confronting climate change, has so much to do also with these deep histories in which they're rooted. And so if anything, I just hope students feel really proud of their own background and see that as they become leaders in addressing climate change, that in some ways they may be the first in their family to do it in a certain kind of way, but in many ways they're actually carrying on these legacies.
Wow, that's really inspiring. I'm sure you're learning a lot from your students. Yeah, besides being inspired by these amazing stories every day in your work, how are you applying this knowledge and your learning in your daily life?
Yeah, well, I guess in a lot of ways, but I think maybe the most important is just recognizing just how critical it is to support Indigenous communities and communities of color that are building their own forms of regenerative agriculture. And in many cases, not using those terms for it, because in many cases, communities have their own language that predates the language of regenerative agriculture. So really thinking about that in my life as an eater, as a voter, as a community member, as a citizen, there are all these layers in which I have agency and I have power and I have privilege. And so thinking about how to be a food citizen in that sense, or to contribute to that reality of food sovereignty. And then, of course, the huge benefit to that is that it's really delicious and has led to experiencing a lot of incredible cultural foods and some really incredible land-based cultural practices as well. And I think, that's been one of the biggest learnings for me, is just how powerful it is to shift that leadership, recognizing that 98% of agricultural land in this country is white owned. We can't go forward like that. So especially as a white person, what can I do to support people in reclaiming land justice, reclaiming food sovereignty?
Wow, really great reminders. Thank you. You write that by coming together to rebuild these farmlands, we can not only heal our planet and its carbon cycle, we can heal ourselves and our communities too. Tell us about what you mean in healing ourselves and our communities.
Yeah, I think that, at the point that I recognized that the reason we have a climate problem in agriculture ultimately dates back to colonization. The land is wounded from a colonial process that has been ongoing. It's had several stages. And if we don't heal it, it will continue to replicate in various forms. So that industrial moment after World War II, that was a kind of deepening of that colonial wound. And those wounds of colonization, they're also carried in people's bodies and in communities and in, a climate of racial injustice, in a lot of structural problems that we have in society as well. And certainly some people are on the front lines of those issues and feel that in really acute ways and are most harmed. And those people are those that should be in leadership roles and that we should be thinking most about in designing policy and those kinds of responses. All that said, I think that everybody in a society marked by colonization, that's carrying the legacy of colonization, ultimately feels the wound of that at some level. because it's disrupting the kind of interconnection among lives that I think we all yearn for as what it means to really be whole. And that has to do with connections among people, connections between people and land. Maybe if you're on this call, you've experienced that sometime in a community garden where you had this moment where there you were with a bunch of diverse people. Maybe it was a work day, maybe you were seeding or transplanting or harvesting, but you had your hands in the ground, you could hear the birds, maybe you saw a pollinator. And there was this sense of like, we're all gathered here, we know we're interconnected, and we're doing something that we know we're going to share the benefits of. I think that's what we all as living beings are craving. And so that's the promise of healing grounds. That's the promise of approaching regenerative agriculture in this deep way that really does go directly at colonization, is that yes, we can draw down some carbon out of the atmosphere, and at the same time, we can create lives for all of us that are more whole.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think for our viewers who have yet to read your book, I think this will be an excellent read to dig deeper into these topics. So thank you so much. And we'll just take a couple of quick questions from the live stream here. Here's one. Can you speak a little bit about biodynamic agriculture and its chances to becoming mainstream agriculture?
That's a great question, because I know biodynamics is really rooted in soil and soil health. I don't know a whole lot about it. It's not something I've ever studied formally. I have some friends with biodynamic farms, and I know that the whole system of preparations and adding organic matter back to the soil is really thorough. So I think that would be, a fascinating topic, maybe for another time for me. I know there's a lot of folks who've written about it as well. But I think that insight that basically one needs to return to the soil everything that one extracts from it. I've seen that in a lot of different kind of wisdom systems, biodynamics being one of them. So yeah, thank you for raising that.
Yeah. Have you received any pushback related to your book?
I really haven't, which has been somewhat surprising to me. I don't know. I mean, maybe some folks aren't ready for the conversation, but they just don't write to me about it. Or honestly, I've been surprised by the people who have written to me and said that they are grateful to be having these conversations, that they are grateful to be thinking explicitly about race in connection to agricultural sustainability. And you know what? That's because social movements have just done incredible work over the past many, many, many years. But you think about what happened in 2020 after George Floyd's murder. Also, it was an incredible moment for the land back movement. For so many social movements, I think that these last 2 years have been a time of reaching a lot of people in society with these brilliantly eloquent messages after many, many, many years of organizing. And so I think I really benefit from having released this book after all those conversations have happened. And I think a lot of people actually really are primed and ready. And so I'm not the first person that they've heard say like, oh gosh, I think we need to pay attention to race. So I guess thank you to people who were willing to be the first person to have that conversation about race, because that's really hard work. And honestly, I feel like I haven't had to do that I've had, the incredible privilege and benefit of being in dialogue with people who are already ready to talk about these issues.
Our very last question is, what first got you interested in food systems? What sparked your interest in all this material?
Yeah, well, honestly, my grandmother, she lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. She was born and raised in Western Nebraska. She was a really important person in my life. I was lucky to have a lot of time with her. She passed away a few years ago now, but when I was little, her stories about growing up connected to land just really captivated me. And it seemed like she had this groundedness and this wisdom from that land connection that was with her through her whole life. Just this deep sense of how to carry herself, among other things. She was just grounded. And I really wanted that for myself. And she also was really honest with me about the tragedy of the Dust Bowl and what it was like to experience that as a young woman, and just the dissolution of her community, the evaporation of her family's livelihood and the loss of that relationship with land. And what she understood about why that happened was pretty sophisticated. She said, look, the government agents came around and they told my dad to plow like this, but that probably wasn't the right thing to do. She knew it wasn't the right thing to do, that had been mistaken, like gravely mistaken. And really the whole idea of going to Western Nebraska and plowing it up for those kinds of crops was mistaken. And over time for me, reflecting on, wow, like why were my European American immigrant ancestors managing land in Western Nebraska in the first place, right on the heels of this violent displacement of Indigenous people. So all of those, conversations and reflections really led to my interest in, trying to rekindle a relationship with land for myself, but B, right relationship with land, like some kind of a way to be in relationship with land that wouldn't lead to another Dust Bowl, that wouldn't lead to another displacement of Indigenous people, that would be in some sense healing. And so that's the kind of deep roots for me. I went through many years of going around and asking farmers about their stories, first as a folklore major, then as a country singer, then as a staffer for United States Senator John Tester, who's an organic farmer, ultimately as a graduate student, but all kind of on, I think, the same journey of seeking this wisdom of how we find healing on land and with each other.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your personal connection to this work too. And yeah, I think we can all relate in some ways to that for sure. So. Thank you so much for everyone for your time today. And if you have further questions for Liz that we didn't get to today, she can be found on Twitter. As a reminder that we'll be giving away 5 free copies of Healing Grounds today. You can find the entry information in the chat. And you can find copies on islandpress.com and use the code webinar for 30% off. So thank you to our guest, Liz Carlisle, for joining us today, and everyone who was able to listen in. So thank you.
Thank you, Jade. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your questions.